Hello, this is David Gordon-Koch reporting for the NB Media Co-op from Moncton. New Brunswick Premier Susan Holt says that interprovincial trade liberalization is an important part of her strategy to respond to U.S. President Donald Trump's trade war. However, union leaders are warning that it could serve as a Trojan horse for deregulation.
We just want to make sure that, when we're doing the interprovincial trade, that we're not accepting the lowest possible standards to get this deal done. We want to make sure that workers' health and safety is at the highest priority. We're calling on the government to create a working group with workers and unions. We're calling for Indigenous communities, and we're also calling for business representatives because we feel everybody is a stakeholder.
Ottawa has said that it will remove a number of internal trade barriers, and Premier Holt has called for a free trade area in the Atlantic region. The province has introduced amendments liberalizing alcohol sales and increasing interprovincial labor mobility while signing memorandums of agreement with Ontario and Newfoundland.
There's also the work that we're doing with the other provinces in Atlantic Canada and with the rest of the country to take down the regulatory barriers that add cost and challenge to doing business in Canada.
On Thursday, the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives Nova Scotia and the Nova Scotia Federation of Labour held an online event featuring several Canadian labour movement officials who said that the consequences of internal trade liberalization could be bad for ordinary Canadians. We go now to highlights from that discussion, followed by uncut footage of the event.
We're demanding bold, proactive government action to mobilize our economic resources for shared prosperity. That means immediate steps to retain good union jobs, expand high-quality job opportunities for people in Canada, using public investment, public procurement to preserve and expand manufacturing, industrial capacity, value added in Canada, transforming our economy to meet our climate goals, accelerating the creation of affordable non-market housing in Canada, which we desperately need, building out our transportation, energy, public transit, social infrastructure, fixing our EI system, protecting and expanding public services, addressing the holes in our social programs. The whole program of internal trade liberalization is at best a distraction from what's urgently needed right now. At worst, it undermines good jobs and government's ability to undertake these economic measures to develop the economy in the interests of working people.
There's nothing that business lobby groups love more than a crisis that will allow them to exploit the working class even further to advance their own agenda. And so that is what's at play in Newfoundland and Labrador as we talk about internal trade and as these conversations unfold at our roundtable. So that's why it's really important that we not allow governments to be drawn into this race to the bottom that Chris has outlined by dismantling policies and regulations under the guise of eliminating those so-called trade barriers. We can't allow them to be a Trojan horse for deregulation and weakening protections that unions have long fought for on behalf of our members.
We deal with some of the biggest, most difficult employers on the planet, auto companies, energy companies, transport companies, you name it. We are across a bargaining table from them. We understand their DNA and we understand the kinds of decisions that they make when the world becomes uncertain. And right now, instead of standing up to Donald Trump, they are looking for ways to appease him. And one of the things they're appeasing him with are Canadian jobs, and in some cases, and a lot of cases, uniform members' jobs. I will also say to you, as the president of the country's largest private sector union, where most of the people who work and who are directly impacted by this trade war, we have described this as the fight of our lives because it is. We have already seen job losses across the country. We have seen lost investment. We have seen shelved investment. This is very, very dangerous for the future economy. It's very dangerous for the manufacturing sector. And Donald Trump has been very clear. He's coming for our jobs.
Welcome, everyone, to this seminar, the webinar on tariffs and interprovincial trade in Atlantic Canada, hosted by the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives with support from lots of different unions. We'll get into that in just a sec. I wanted to say, who am I? My name is Ajay Parasaram. I am a longtime member of the CCPA Steering Committee, and I sell my labor for a wage at Dalhousie University, where I am at the moment, um, where I teach about colonialism and capitalism. And I'm really excited, as I know you are too, to learn from our panelists and speakers this evening about what is, according to some, the most beautiful word in the dictionary: tariffs. I want to send a special welcome to, or a special shout out to Justice for Workers, Nova Scotia. As I understand it, they've organized a watch party over at Glitterbean Cafe down the road, which is a rad worker-run cafe, owned and operated. It's a pillar for progressive communities in the city. So welcome to you in particular. And yeah, in just a moment, I'll be inviting Jennifer Murray from Unifor Atlantic to make some opening remarks. But before I do, I wanted to acknowledge that all of our discussions about tariffs and interprovincial trade are happening on stolen Indigenous land. And in my case, from where I am, that's Mi'kmaq land in Mi'kma'ki. And we can't lose sight of the fact that prior to this whole Canadian and international legal order, international or Indigenous international legal orders thoughtfully guided commerce, development, politics through reciprocal obligations that covered from the Wabanaki Confederacy to the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, covering the region that we might call today Atlantic Canada. So as we recognize the land on which we are, let's keep in mind our obligations to land, waters, and the people who have protected it for thousands of years. So procedurally, after we've heard from Jennifer, I'm going to open the floor to Christine Saulnier and Chris Roberts, who are going to give us a bit of a snapshot of kind of where we are on the issue of tariffs and trade. And then following this report, we're going to hear from Lena Payne, President for Uniform, Jessica McCormick, President of the Newfoundland and Labrador Federation of Labor. And then we're going to have a kind of open roundtable discussion. And then we'll hear some closing remarks from Danny Cavanaugh from the Nova Scotia Federation of Labor. We've got an exciting and tight hour planned, so let's jump right into it. Jennifer Murray, if you please, the floor is yours.
Okay, can you hear me okay? Thank you. So hello, friends. Like's already been said, my name is Jen Murray, and I am Unifor's Atlantic Regional Director. Thank you so much for joining us to talk with all of you about tariffs, this trade war that we are currently facing in this country, and the true challenges regarding interprovincial trade in Atlantic Canada. We know that we're all in a time of great uncertainty and have been living this uncertainty since the talk of tariffs began. We're seeing a great deal of interprovincial trade regulations being changed and loosened as if this is the solution to the problem. You're going to hear from some very influential and powerful speakers tonight who are out there fighting to protect Canadian jobs every single day and have been doing so for many months now. These Canadian leaders have been bringing workers' voices to provincial roundtables, and federally, Lena Payne is sitting on the Prime Minister's Trade Council. Together, they will respond to questions tonight, such as, how is the tariff war affecting workers and their families and communities? What types of interprovincial cooperation are needed to fight against the Trump tariffs? And what worker-centered policies are needed? In the work I have done on this file so far, there is no doubt in my mind that we cannot leave it to others to decide the path forward for our country. Doing so would mean leaving workers out of the equation, and I know for certain that we cannot do that. There is a path forward and a way through this crisis, and the only path forward is actually together. I think that you will see that on this meeting, we will realize that it is going to take all of us united to protect good Canadian jobs.
Thank you so much for that, Jen. I would now like to open it to Christine Saulnier, Director of CCPA Nova Scotia, and Chris Roberts, National Director, Social and Economic Policy Department, Canadian Labour Congress.
Thanks so much, and thanks everyone for joining us this evening. I am going to start with what are tariffs and what is a trade war. I know we've all had to, if we didn't know it before, learn about these things, and just so we're all on the same page. Of course, we now know that a tariff is a tax that a government places on goods and services imported from other countries. the importing company must pay them and has a choice, but most pass on to the consumers. So a US tariff on a Canadian good imported to the US passed on to the US consumer essentially becomes a consumer tax. Tariffs, of course, affect consumer spending, which is really important because it makes up about 60% of our economy. So depending on what's happening, and the decision to put a tariff on will then impact trade flows, government revenue, exchange rates, employment, economic growth, and inflation. So here we are, and it seems every day or every week at least, we're hearing about new tariffs being imposed by the United States. And so why are they imposing tariffs? Well, I mean, one of the reasons obviously is that higher tariffs is discouraging consumers in the United States to buy products from Canada or elsewhere. High tariffs, though, also generate revenue for government. And of course, it's about broader foreign policy leverage, as we know is happening currently. The direct impact on a province's economy depends, of course, on its main industries and how trade exposed they are. So I thought I'd briefly go over what are we talking about in Atlantic Canada, and I know there's lots of people on the call that can add to this conversation, but just to lay the groundwork. So it's been said that actually the tariffs might have the smallest impact on Nova Scotia. Nova Scotia's GDP is actually 81% services. International good exports is only 11% of our GDP. But of those exports, 68% of them are exported to the United States. That is actually among the lowest provincial rate in Canada. The industries impacted in Nova Scotia include tire production through Michelin, fishing, plus forestry products. And of course, Nova Scotia is facing double tariffs on seafood when it's facing tariffs from China as well as the US. And that's really its second largest export is seafood, 80% of which goes to both China and the United States. Of course, yesterday, the day before, Trump announced a 100% tariff on the film industry. So that will have an impact on Nova Scotia's film industry, depending on what that all looks like. And if we look quickly at New Brunswick's GDP is 75% service. And so not as trade exposed as some other provinces, but if you dig down, of course, St. John has Canada's largest oil refinery. Over 80% of its oil is exported to the United States. As for Prince Edward Island, I actually learned this. I did not know PEI had an aerospace industry, but it does, along with frozen food, seafood, and vegetables. Now, only 15% of its GDP are goods exports, but we know that the province that in the Atlantic that has the most exposure is Newfoundland and Labrador. Its oil sector and its supporting industries related to energy are exposed. They are the most heavily dependent in the Atlantic on international good exports for their economy, which accounts for 30% of their GDP. That's actually the third highest of any province in Canada. Now that's direct trade, but of course this is about more than direct trade. It has a ripple effect across the economy, across the country. The anxiety, the job loss, what is next is here and everywhere across Canada. And so as Jennifer said in the opening, what are the solutions to the crisis? And what we want to talk about is what's been offered and what else could we do in terms of centering workers and good jobs locally. The Nova Scotia government was first off the hop with this announcement around removing interprovincial barriers as the way forward. So tackling the exceptions that are left in the Canadian Free Trade Bill. The Nova Scotia government passed sweeping legislation that is asking other Canadian provinces and territories to mutually agree on the rules governing the flow of goods, services, investment, and labor across provinces and territories. So far, Ontario, New Brunswick, and PEI have said yes. To what exactly? Not clear at all. The Nova Scotia government also said, though, that it would cancel American contracts. Now, PEI has similar language, and maybe other provinces too. That's the kind of initiative that we actually kind of want to see. More local procurement, if not canceling contracts. How do we support local jobs paying decent wages? How do we enable using local companies? Well, unfortunately, a lot of local provinces have already been outlawed under the Canadian Free Trade Agreement and regional procurement agreements. It's perhaps not surprising then that we heard Nova Scotia canceled some small contracts worth a total of 130,000, and it just awarded bridge painting and repair contract of 70 million to an American consortium, saying that there was no local company that could take on the work. Of course, smaller provinces like ours in the Atlantic in particular should be concerned about losing any more business to large businesses. And when we underline what does it mean to have this kind of sweeping legislation, we can thank the CCPA and many of my colleagues across the country. I think Stuart True is on the call tonight, who leads our trade investment project, for the amazing research that's coming out of CCPA around what does the rhetoric actually mean about decreasing barriers. It is a false solution aimed at more deregulation and boosting corporate profits. It's not one that's going to allow for any substantial replacement of reduction in US trade, create jobs, or some substantial economic growth. Chris will go over some of the other significant concerns. Let me end with this. It's quite striking to me as I was looking at Scott Sinclair, who's actually no longer with CCPA, he retired. He wrote in 2017, when the Canadian Free Trade Bill was finalized, this is what he said, quote, "Will business lobbies, now that they've gotten most of what they've been pushing for in the Canadian Free Trade Agreement, finally stop complaining about internal trade barriers and get on to other issues like boosting their lackluster productivity? Don't count on it. It's such a great hook for justifying deregulation that we can safely assume the complaints will persist." And here we are with the complaints coming again as we need to really refocus again on what lessons have we learned from 40 years of so-called free trade, the chill that's been put on the important role of governments in Canada for protecting and enhancing our social, economic, and environmental well-being, and what we can do here to protect good jobs. And so I'm going to end there with my little backgrounder and hand it over to Chris Roberts.
Well, thanks so much, Christine. And thank you to the organizers. It's a real pleasure to be here with you tonight. On behalf of CLC President B. Brusk, who really wanted to be here but had a scheduling conflict. Just to let you know off the top, I'm speaking to you from the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe peoples in Ottawa. I'm going to use my time to provide a bit of context for the drive toward internal trade liberalization and labor mobility, building on Christine's excellent comments already. I'll try to speak to the new legislation that we've seen in Ontario and Atlantic Canadian provinces, but the subject is pretty complex and can get murky really quickly. So I want to start by just getting across one message. If there's only one thing you remember from my comments this evening, it should be this: that interprovincial trade liberalization, deregulation, internal trade, labor mobility. These are priorities of industry and business. The priority demands of working people and the labor movement in this crisis are very different. If you're listening to government talking points, pundits' commentary, media coverage, you'd think that there is a severe problem with freedom of trade and movement of labor in Canada. I mean, the very first bill we've been told to expect from the new government in Ottawa will be around internal trade liberalization. That is their top priority. Prime Minister Carney wants perfect free trade in Canada by Canada Day. In fact, the Prime Minister talked on the campaign trail and in his press releases about, quote, the need to build one Canadian economy instead of 13, almost as if each province had its own currency and you needed a Manitoba passport to go from Winnipeg to Regina. But in fact, Canada, as I'll try to explain, has relatively few real impediments to interprovincial commerce and the movement of workers. So I just want to stress right off the top the difference that working people and unions priorities are with those of business and industry at the moment. We're demanding bold, proactive government action to mobilize our economic resources for shared prosperity. That means immediate steps to retain good union jobs, expand high quality job opportunities for people in Canada, using public investment, public procurement to preserve and expand manufacturing, industrial capacity, value added in Canada, transforming our economy to meet our climate goals, accelerating the creation of affordable non-market housing in Canada, which we desperately need, building out our transportation, energy, public transit, social infrastructure, fixing our EI system, protecting and expanding public services, addressing the holes in our social programs. These are the components of our program that we are calling on governments to proactively spearhead and carry off in Canada. But what that means is that I think for us, the whole program of internal trade liberalization is at best a distraction from what's urgently needed right now. At worst, it undermines good jobs and government's ability to undertake these economic measures to develop the economy in the interests of working people. So what are interprovincial trade barriers? Well, these are just simply barriers to the free movement of persons, goods, services, and investments within Canada. Typically, trade barriers don't take the form in Canada of explicit barriers or charges on commerce across provincial territorial borders. Rather, we're talking about trade barriers that are the costs of doing business across internal borders. So the cost of complying with rules, regulations, standards, certifications as they vary from one province to the other. For decades in this country, industry and business voices have insisted that these are an urgent priority, reducing these costs to doing business interprovincially in Canada. But most scholarly studies have been unable to find significant obstacles to interprovincial commerce. And there's all kinds of reasons for that, which I really don't have time to get into. Part of it's distance. I mean, it's 6,000 miles separating Vancouver and Halifax, but 230 kilometers, I should say, 230 kilometers from Vancouver to Seattle and 2,000 to Los Angeles. So it's just closer to big markets in the United States. But so really the estimates were a very minimal economic gains to eliminating any remaining barriers to the movement of labor and capital in Canada. But more recently, business-funded voices have estimated much higher gains from internal trade liberalization. And that's where we get to the present. The business groups have really used the external Trump trade tariff crisis as an opportunity and excuse to drive forward very radical changes to rules that provinces put in place to regulate provincial economies in the interests of workers, the public, and the environment. So that's what we're seeing with these bills that really enshrine the concept of mutual recognition, the idea that provinces will agree to unilaterally disarm, basically rid themselves of their regulatory capacity, so long as a reciprocating jurisdiction, another province, decides that a business or an operator or a skilled professional is fully certified, fully licensed, and fully approved to do business, then they will accept that as well. There are lots of problems with this approach, not all of which I can really get into. But one of the most important things I want to emphasize is that we're talking about job losses. If provinces agree to get rid of their regulatory assessment, evaluation of risk, compliance testing, inspection, enforcement, all of that all goes out the window. That's where the big estimates of economic gains come from, in my view, is that you're just getting rid of a lot of public sector work that goes into protecting the public, the environment, and working people. That's part of the problem. But the last thing I'll say, and I've gone way over already, but I'll just finish by saying that these bills are being rushed forward with no economic or environmental impact analysis whatsoever, no consultation with labor and affected groups, stakeholder organizations. All of the detail in these bills, some of which are 1 page or 2 pages, are going to be contained in the regulations. And the provinces, in many instances, have essentially indemnified themselves if things go wrong. That is, they've said in the legislation, no one can take us to court if something goes terribly wrong. And that is really disturbing. And I think this juggernaut is moving so quickly that we haven't had a true opportunity to ask fundamental questions about whose interests are being served here. I'm sorry to go on so long, Jai, but much more. There's much more to be said. Obviously, hopefully others will chime in.
Thank you so much, Chris. I mean, I just took furious notes the whole time you were talking, and I'm sure everyone else was as well. So thank you for that. And we're now going to turn to the roundtable discussion, and we'll hear first from Lena Payne, the president for Unifor. And yeah, please, Lena, the floor is yours.
Hi, can everyone hear me? Thumbs up or a yes would be great. Okay. I'll try to focus on the topic at hand, but I will say to you that probably a little bit in response to what Chris was saying, that we too, as a labor movement, have used the Trump threat to argue for things. And if we're not, then that would be silly of us not to do that. Including talking about what a more resilient Canadian economy could look like by using industrial policy and procurement and all of the resources and levers and all of the things that we have in this country to be able to build a stronger economy. So I think this is to be expected, that the business community would try to exploit this moment. We've been saying this from the beginning. And exploit it to also try to roll back workers' rights. So we have to be on our guard, because they do see things like the right to strike. They do see things like workers' rights, health and safety rights, all of these things that we fought for in different provinces to make sure that we're raising the standard for everybody as a threat to trade. I believe one of the things that we must do to turn around this argument is that, we need to be consistent in the labor movement about what actually is the biggest internal trade barrier that we have in Canada. And that is actually infrastructure. And how do we move people safely and smoothly and goods safely and smoothly across this country? So that's incredibly important, that we are also getting our message out there and making sure that it's being heard. This is not a small problem. This is a complete reset of the Canadian economy. It is a rethink, and we have to reimagine what Canada can look like in a world in which we cannot rely, and nor can business in Canada rely on the United States as a safe or secure or reliable trading partner. So that's the reality of the moment that we're in. And in that moment, I believe we have opportunity. I will also say to you, as the president of the country's largest private sector union, where most of the people who work and who are directly impacted by this trade war, we have described this as the fight of our lives, because it is. We have already seen job losses across the country. We have seen lost investment. We have seen shelved investment. This is very, very dangerous for the future economy. It's very dangerous for the manufacturing sector. And Donald Trump has been very clear. He's coming for our jobs. And every action that he has taken since January 21st has shown that that's exactly what's at play here. And so for us, it's not just what Donald Trump is doing, it is what corporations are doing to respond to Donald Trump. And this is the biggest challenge we're facing in Canada right now, because many of them, and I've said this to our members, we deal with some of the biggest, most difficult employers on the planet: auto companies, energy companies, transport companies, you name it. we are across a bargaining table from them. We understand their DNA, and we understand the kinds of decisions that they make when the world becomes uncertain. And right now, instead of standing up to Donald Trump, they are looking for ways to appease him. And one of the things they're appeasing him with are Canadian jobs, and in some cases, and a lot of cases, uniform members' jobs. So we have a lot at stake in this trade war. Our members have a lot at stake, and that's why I think I've done 400 media interviews since January 21st, because we have to make sure that we are getting across what the problem is and also being propositional about what the solutions are here. And of course, some of those solutions are very clear. It is about how we work our way through this trade war, how we had to respond as a country to these tariffs, because the reality is if we did not respond swiftly and strongly, we would have been perceived as being weak. And when we eventually get to a negotiating table, that would have been the worst possible place for us to be, which is why the counter tariffs were so important. Secondly, we have been proposing what we call non-tariff responses. There are any number of things here that Canada can do in that regard. How do we use the revenue, for example, that we're collecting in tariffs and will collect in tariffs on the United States to support working people, to support the fact that we want to keep workers working, to support industries in Canada, and to be proactive about using our procurement dollars to support Canadian work and to build what we can build here, whether it's in the aerospace sector, increasing our capacity in that regard, whether it's in the defense sector, because let's face it, the world is a less safe place for all of us right now. And, you know, this is not a spot I thought we'd be in, but we are going to have to spend procurement dollars on how we protect the Arctic, for example. And then, of course, there's any number of other things that we can do, such as why would we accept bids from a Chinese company on transit in Toronto when we have members, uniform members in Thunder Bay that can build those subway cars? Let's just start doing it and pushing for it and getting people out of their comfort zone in terms of thinking that we have to abide right now by any trade agreement with the United States. Donald Trump has already ripped it up. So let's do what we have to do to support Canadian workers. I think finally, I would say to you, you know, we're right now fighting on a number of fronts. It's the auto industry at the moment that's feeling the biggest pain as a result of these tariffs. We have had any number of jobs basically lost as a result. We've had shifting production gone to the United States. So I would say to you, for our union, we are in a place where we know something is coming and that there is going to be a moment. It'll be a large Donnybrook of a moment when we will have to fight back very hard to make sure that we're protecting Canadian jobs. And what we have said to the federal government here is that they need to punish, and there are a number of ways that they can do that, any corporation in Canada that shifts work out of Canada in order to appease Donald Trump's illegal tariffs. And we need our government to be bold. And that means we need everybody, as Jen said off the top, on this together and sharing and making sure we're speaking from the same page here so that we can pressure this federal government and the provincial governments to actually stand up and be strong. The last thing I would say is the real issue as well, which we can't leave out of this discussion, is what's happening now in Alberta and partially in Saskatchewan with a premier that is trying to drive a national unity crisis in our country. This is the exact opposite of what we need right now in Canada. This will show weakness for our country in dealing with Donald Trump. It is not helpful, and it is diverting attention from what is the real problem. And that's how do we protect Canadian jobs? How do we protect Canadian workers? And how do we make sure we keep good union jobs in this country? Because if you look at the sectors that are being attacked by Donald Trump, those are the ones in the private sector that have high unionization rates. And in my mind, this is a deunionization strategy by the President of the United States. Okay, happy to take questions whenever you're ready. And I'm sure it's going to Jess now.
Thank you, Lena. Yeah, much to think about there. And we are indeed Moving on to, where's my notes? Yeah, Jessica McCormick, President of the Newfoundland and Labrador Federation of Labor. Floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me on the webinar tonight. The Federation of Labor in Newfoundland and Labrador unites and represents 70,000 workers across our province. I'm joining you tonight from the unceded traditional territory of the Mi'kmaq and the Beothuk on Uctamunguk, which is the colonial name for Newfoundland. And so I'm going to speak to you a little bit about what has been happening in Newfoundland and Labrador in response to the tariffs, and maybe specifically drill down on some of the work that we're doing with our trade roundtable that has been convened by our provincial government. But I'll start by setting the stage a little bit in terms of what we're hearing from our members in this province. And like workers right across the country in Newfoundland and Labrador, our members and their families continue to deal with the anxiety and worry and fear that has been created as a result of this trade war. Various industries, some of which have already been named and kind of are similar in the Maritimes, fishing, manufacturing, forestry, our energy sector, for example, are all dealing with various levels of fallout from Trump's unpredictable decisions, which is leaving people, in particular workers, unable to plan and prepare for the future. And the uncertainty and chaos that has been caused by this unprecedented attack on our economy is compounding the stress that people are already feeling, the strain that they're already feeling. And I'm sure many of you on the webinar are in this same situation. We're feeling the pressure of rising costs of living. We have been for quite some time. We're feeling the pressure of a lack of access to affordable childcare, a housing crisis. So all of these issues existed pre-tariffs and have only been exacerbated by the unpredictable nature of the state of our economy right now. So with all of this in mind, and Lana has already outlined a lot of this, and so have Christine and Chris in their preamble. This is why it's so crucial from our perspective that all levels of government invest in workers and communities, public services, infrastructure, our industrial capacity, as Lana has outlined, public transportation. These are just a few examples. And this is a tall task, but I do believe if we approach this as a united front of working class people and unions, that we can rise to the challenge. But to succeed, in my view, and in the view of our Federation of Labor, workers must have a seat at that table. So workers and their unions must be involved in the planning, coordinating, advocating, and shaping of the policies that affect our members' lives. In Newfoundland and Labrador, we are working hard to do just that through the Roundtable on Trade that our Premier has convened. And now for those of you that don't know me, I'll let you know that I don't have a lot of reasons to give a pat on the back to our politicians here in this province and our Premier. And more often than not, I am holding them to account on behalf of my members. But I will give some credit to Andrew Furey in our province because very early on, as this crisis began to unfold, he did bring people together. In this roundtable, he brought stakeholders to the table in a way that other provinces and territories didn't very early on. So in late 2024, when the tariff talk was really starting to ramp up, but before Trump was installed, Andrew Furey quickly pulled together a roundtable to discuss what our response would be in Newfoundland and Labrador. And more importantly, and I think at the time this was really critical, share information with stakeholders, sharing information with unions, with industry that generated conversations and discussion and solution building, and allowed us the opportunity to kind of share information back to the Premier, which then he brought forward in the other conversations that he was having. And so the roundtable consisted of a diverse range of stakeholders, both from unions, industry, municipalities are at the table, non-governmental and community sector organizations are at the table. Obviously, and it's no surprise to you folks, there's a very healthy representation from the business community. And this is why it's so important to have unions across from them to hold them to account and to bring our perspective to the discussion. So throughout these meetings and in the ongoing communication that we've had with the senior staff in the provincial government, our federation has consistently emphasized the necessity to prioritize workers' voices, our concerns, our perspectives, and our needs in the strategic response that our provincial government was developing. We've also been clear in these conversations that now is not the time for employers to use this situation as an excuse to erode progress workers and their unions have made at the bargaining table. And I'll speak a little bit more about that in a second. I will say we've made some real progress in these discussions. Our premier has consistently raised the need for worker support programs at First Ministers meetings and with the federal government. And he's also heeded our warnings on internal trade, some of them, especially in terms of protecting good unionized jobs in Newfoundland and Labrador, like those at the Molson and Labatt breweries, where workers are members of FFAW, Unifor, and NAPE, respectively. And those jobs are very good jobs in our city. And in the course of these discussions around internal trade that Chris has done a great job of laying out, our ability to control and maintain the regulations we have around the sale of alcohol in Newfoundland and Labrador, that's something that we really want to protect, because we know that the multinational corporations that control and operate these breweries would, not waste an opportunity to move that production to another part of the country where it would be more lucrative, cheaper to produce these products and then ship them into the province. So we were able to make some really significant progress on this front and would not have been able to do that, in my view, had we not been at this roundtable. Speaking on behalf of members, and Jennifer Murray from Unifor is doing that as well on behalf of Unifor members at Molson. So that's some real productive work that's happening. As of this past Saturday, some of you might know that we have a new premier in Newfoundland and Labrador. It was a competition between two Johns, and John Hogan won out over John Abbott. So on the top of our list of priorities for Premier Designate Hogan, it's going to be continuing these stakeholder discussions and continuing to listen to the workers themselves who are on the front lines of the trade war. I also expect that we'll continue to face considerable pressure from the other premiers on the issue of internal trade, because Andrew Furey was an outlier resisting the kind of piling on the momentum of internal trade discussions across the country. So that's why being at this table is so important. We're also pushing for industry-specific subtables in Newfoundland and Labrador so that we can have more focused conversations about developing strategy for the industries that are most trade exposed. And as you know, that can change from week to week depending on what Donald Trump is thinking. But this has been alluded to as well. There's nothing that business lobby groups love more than a crisis that will allow them to exploit the working class even further to advance their own agenda. And so that is what's at play in Newfoundland and Labrador as we talk about internal trade and as these conversations unfold at our roundtable. So that's why it's really important that we not allow governments to be drawn into this race to the bottom that Chris has outlined by dismantling policies and regulations under the guise of eliminating those so-called trade barriers. We can't allow them to be a Trojan horse for deregulation and weakening protections that unions have long fought for on behalf of our members. And nor can we allow those corporations to roll back the progress we've made at the bargaining table. And so I just want to take a quick second to raise the impact that this can have on collective bargaining. In Newfoundland and Labrador, we are heading into public sector bargaining in the coming year. And I'm sure there are, many other employers in the private sector that are also going to be at the bargaining table. And these tactics will be no different, whether it's public or private sector. So we will really need to organize like never before to build worker power and send a message to those employers and governments that austerity and cuts are not the answer to this trade war. And in fact, a strong public sector is indispensable to Canada's ability to adapt and grow and change. Our economic resilience and success depends on workers who provide, first-rate healthcare, high-quality childcare, education and training, the timely and efficient delivery of government services, programs like employment insurance, for example, which will be incredibly important and need to be enhanced in these times. So I'll wrap it up and we can have more of a discussion on all this. But the key takeaway from me tonight is that we've got to keep the pressure on. In the Atlantic Canada context, I think we've got to keep the pressure on our premiers to collaborate and listen to workers. Workers are not interested, I know I'm certainly not interested in being used as a prop or a photo op for premiers who are looking to score political points in these times. That engagement has to be meaningful, and we have to be a part of developing those solutions. We should be included in every space, in every meeting, in every discussion that will impact our workplaces, our communities, our economy, and our future. I also think we've got to be on the ground, on the shop floor, in our workplaces, out in the community, talking to our members about their ideas, their concerns, their hopes for the future, and how their unions can work with them to make those hopes a reality. I think in the context of internal trade, these conversations are incredibly important. There's a lot of misinformation that's floating around about the ease of access to products that you think you might not be able to buy in your respective province right now because of these internal trade barriers, the enhancements to GDP that we'll see and the benefits to our economy. But when we get out there and talk to people and bust some of these myths that are being perpetuated by the business lobby, we can actually make a difference and build our numbers and our support for the proposals that we're putting forward as a labor movement. And so my final message is that, in times of crisis, we have to remember and act on the working class solidarity that is at the heart of the labor movement, which is that we leave no one behind. And I think that is the message that we want to carry forward as we navigate these really tumultuous times. So I'll leave it there and look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jessica. We have lots to chew on, folks, and about 10 minutes for discussion. What I'm going to do is ask if you do want to pose the question. In the interest of time, it would be best if you could put it in the chat window, and that way our guests, our panelists, can actually see the question written. And what we'll do is maybe I'll read a couple of the questions out loud, and then we'll go through and ask the panelists to react to that. And while you're thinking of your questions, one of the things that I think we heard connecting all of these speakers was the problem that, it seems that so long as labor is treated as a factor input rather than the source of value, we're always going to end up in the structural situation where corporate interests presents itself as the entirety of the economy. I mean, this is one of the things that I've learned listening to all of this. Because I have to say, I mean, I even thought that, free trade meant cheaper BC wine or something like that. And they certainly didn't present it as in the way that we've heard from our panelists here. So, I guess, well, I'll just have a look and see if anyone's posed any questions as yet. None as yet. So, I mean, maybe I would like to pose one to whoever wants to answer it is, we heard that there's no point in trying to adhere to trade agreements that someone like Donald Trump is issuing in any case, and in terms of how we turn our organizing, is there any way that we can think about, because it seems that in Canada under Prime Minister Carney there's such a push right now for this deregulation, and is there a way in which to try to co-opt that language in some way to try to make maybe the bottom, make the bottom from the most beneficial situation for workers? Is that even possible under this framework, or do we just need to be engaging more in grassroots kind of labor activism in all the different regions simultaneously? Just wondering if there's any way to use this kind of moment to coordinate things, or if you think that we just need to kind of hold the line. Any thoughts on that?
I mean, maybe I'll go quickly, but there's something flying overhead here. I guess, I mean, we shared in the chat the Justice for Workers, Leave No One Behind agenda. I mean, I think it's a nice package of starting points depending on where we go from here. There are some obvious things that are discussed about what we need to be pushing for. Employment insurance reform and support for workers is one, and that's high on their agenda. And I point to them because it's a very practical package of things that they've prepared, including resolutions for convention at unions around supporting the work and standing up and starting to build that solidarity. As a, just a, like a little concrete way forward. But I mean, I think what Lana and Jessica said is that Trump's thrown out the game and the rules, and there's an opportunity. How do we like bust the myths without continuing to repeat them and reframe it? And that infrastructure question, like even if you look at what the businesses say in Nova Scotia, the ones who are exporting are saying there aren't barriers. And the one barrier, if we want to call it that, is exactly what Lana said. It's infrastructure, it's shipping, it's, you know, the grid, the electric grid. It's all the things that we need to be talking about. And whether that it's just reframing and it's always the problem is they present the common sense kind of solution, right? Let's get rid of barriers. So how do we reframe it and take the opportunity to address the kind of investment that we want to see and push? Lana.
I just want my sense of the internal trade. They've done this, and you know, some provinces have passed. Like, I don't think they understand, even a lot of them, except Premier Fury and others, that this is really going to change much. My sense of things, because there's going to be more things that we're going to have to do right now, and internal trade is going to be like in the weeds of where we need to go as a country, that this was something that premiers and the prime minister were talking about in order for people to have confidence that they were doing something. So my sense is that they're going to come up with a couple of things, but the reality is you know, we're not going to change French labeling in our country because some corporation sees this as a barrier because they don't want to have two languages on their labeling. Workers are not going to allow health and safety standards to be rolled back. Like, these are non-starters. And I talk to employers every day and I said, guys, you have to understand, we can be actually working with you on what it is that you really need, which is better infrastructure in this country. But you also have to invest, and they have not been investing. This is the problem. The railway has not been upgraded. Things have not, they've just taken the profits out of these companies and turned them over to shareholders, and have not done their part of the social contract here, which is you operate in Canada, you build in Canada, you do all of those things. You actually have to deliver something for working people. And I think that we're in a situation right now where we can completely flip this argument, if we're all doing it together, to reframe what it is and rethink what it is the economy can actually look like. And yeah, that's going to mean government has to do more, not less, and invest more, not less, in terms of procurement and where it goes and how we support Canadian workers with that. I mean, we spend about $200 billion or something at the federal and provincial levels across this country in procurement in the run of a year. It's a shit ton of money. We can build a lot of stuff with that. Chris would probably have a better number of how many dollars it is, but it's a lot of money. And if we were using it wisely to actually, you know, build the things we need, support supply chains, do all of the stuff that we could do, we could have a completely different country. And we can send a message to Donald Trump because we have leverage. There's a lot of stuff, despite he says he doesn't need it, like aluminum. They can't build stuff without our aluminum. Their farmers can't operate without our potash. You know, energy is trickier because we actually do get energy from the US too, because we do not have a west-east ability to transport enough of that oil to Sarnia or Montreal or wherever it is we'd need to do it from Alberta. But there are certainly things that we can do. And as a movement, I think it's not enough for us to say that this is all bad and these corporations are terrible, even though I do say that every day. We also have to be propositional. We have to explain what we want. What is our economic program? And that is what we put out during the federal election. This is our economic program for Canada. We got 5 big ideas. Someone else, come on, bring in your 5 big ideas. Let's get this going because the window will be short, because eventually there will be an agreement with Trump. And we've got to get things started before we miss that window, is my suggestion right now. That's my proposition.
I can't possibly improve on that. I agree completely with what Lana said. We're really in a moment where you put your finger on the contradiction here, Jaya, that for 50 years, internationally and internally, Canada has been putting all of its eggs in the basket of trade liberalization, deregulation, neoliberalism, getting the state out of the role of planning, economic planning, and industrial policy and the like. And now all of that has gone up in flames overnight, and we're trying to figure out what comes next. And it's business and industry goes back to the same playbook. I mean, you remember a memo that the finance minister Dominic LeBlanc sent to all federal ministers, asking not just for low-cost solutions or responses to the Trump attacks, but zero-cost solutions. They didn't want to spend any money in adjusting to this crisis. And sure enough, what we got was more trade liberalization and deregulation, as if that's going to, chart a new path for Canada in this new world. It ain't. And Trump has thrown out the rule book. He doesn't care about the WTO. He doesn't care about trade agreements. Doesn't care about and we got to start thinking, okay, what does our economy look like if it's not just about more free trade, more integration with the United States? That's a big job. We have to reconsider using government capacity to, and reframing is key. And the internal labor mobility issue is a perfect example. There's tons of studies that show that the impediments that workers face when they want to move somewhere to take a job are things like available care services for their elderly parents or their children, affordable housing, support in form of tax incentives and other supports to actually move to take work. It's positive investments that we need to facilitate the movement of workers if that's the goal. It's not about simply tearing down more rules and protections that are there for good reasons.
I don't want to. I know there are other questions. I'll just hard to add to what Lana has outlined in terms of proposals, but a very wise labor leader from the fish, food, and allied workers here in Newfoundland and Labrador once told me, like, don't get distracted chasing rabbits. And we can't get distracted chasing rabbits, whether it's tinkering with regulations and these discussions about internal trade. We have to stay laser focused on bold proposals to reshape our economy. And if we don't, as Lana has outlined very well, seize this moment and the window is short, or, we're not going to have a chance like this, an opportunity like this. And in fact, I think the world will have changed to such an extent that we might never have another opportunity like this to put forward a worker-centered proposal for what our economy could look like.
Thank you for that. Oh, go ahead, Lena.
I have a question there that I think needs answering. Someone wants to know how we're going to punish corporations who should think they can shift production. So on auto, one of our recommendations to the government, which they agreed to, is that companies who build in Canada and have maintained a certain footprint would not experience the counter tariffs that we put on the United States. And as a result of that, there's a remission type of tariff. So if they do change their footprint, the federal government must actually reconsider now what that tariff relief that they gave them, or the remission. So companies who shift production could very quickly start facing tariffs from Canada on their products. Now, that comes with a bunch of things, but we need to have carrots and sticks in this kind of world in order to make sure that we're not losing massive investment and massive jobs. And I can tell you, we are losing right now investment and jobs. So we have to use that tariff remission, that kind of snapback provision to punish companies. We do have all sorts of other things we can do. They occupy and own a lot of land in Canada. We can think about expropriation since we don't have a trade agreement anymore. Let's go. I mean, come on, let's get bold about this. We have to do things that 6 months ago, none of us could probably say out loud because people would laugh at us. Well, now guess what? They're not laughing at us because we're defending jobs, we're defending this country, and we have to do it with everything we have. and lots of things the government can do to punish corporations who shift production. And that's actually our bold idea number one: is you need to make sure that these companies are not appeasing Donald Trump with our jobs and particularly good union jobs here in Canada, because there's a very big risk to this right now.
Thank you so much for that. There is a huge array of wonderful questions that we don't have time to get to, but I just wanted to note that thematically people are asking about, is it possible to have a federal standard for healthcare workers? Is it possible to have to raise the bar so everybody does better? I can't speak to everything, and a lot of gratitude to the panelists. I'm glad that we did get that specific question answered, and I do want to leave a few minutes so that we can hear from Danny Cavanaugh, who's going to close us out. So, Danny, if you're with us, please, the president of the Nova Scotia Federation of Labor, would love to hear from you.
Oh, thanks. And I want to thank all our panelists for coming on tonight. There's a lot of work that needs to be done, and in particular, I think one of our arguments that I'm using with our government is the fact that we do have a national panel, which Lana is on, and the one that we have in Newfoundland and Labrador that Jessica is on. And, if those can work, at a national level and at a provincial level, then they can work here in Nova Scotia. And we've written the government, we've asked for that. I know we have a lot of work to do, but we need to absolutely have workers at the table to make sure workers' issues are getting raised. And the recent signing of agreements between Nova Scotia and New Brunswick and PEI and Ontario and the mutual recognition are all scary things, and that just really contributes stronger why we need to be at the table. So as a Federation of Labor, when we first talked about doing this kind of meeting, we've pulled the unions together, represent workers that are going to be in the affected sectors here in Nova Scotia, and we're encouraging all our feds to, in the Atlantic region, to push for the same kind of panel to happen. We're going to have a future meeting with our unions, and even bigger, because I think we're at the point here in Nova Scotia now that if the government doesn't want to do anything in terms of having that kind of panel, we'll just do our own panel and we'll invite them to come to our table so we can talk about how we're going to protect workers. So I think, I would encourage people that are on here tonight, and we'll get some messages out. There'll be some work that'll continue to happen. To Lana's point about all of us need to work together and be on the same page here. And that's how we're going to win these fights. And, when it comes to our public sector unions, we need them to be at those tables with us as well, because we need to protect public sector jobs in every community. Losing public sector jobs in small rural communities, well, in any community, will be absolutely devastating. And that's some of the potential things that we face. And just one last point as I kind of wrap up and thank everybody again, that Nova Scotia has some of the worst labor standards in the country. Our labor standards here in Nova Scotia are 50 years old. They haven't been updated entirely in 50 years. So when you look at mutual recognition and the possibilities of what that could mean, it's pretty scary when we know we're facing big business and corporations who want to rip those standards up even further and create that cycle of a downward trend for workers. So no question, we have a lot of work to do, but we need to do that together. And at the end of the day, when our voices are at the table, we'll make some differences for workers, not just in this province, but across the country. And I do have a meeting coming up with the Minister of Labor and some folks, because we have written and we've asked a number of questions. I mean, there's some interesting questions surely around WCB and what that means for people when you're coming here from another province and you get hurt on the job or you get injured on the job. What's that mean? Which standard do you follow? Do you follow, if you come from Ontario, the Ontario standard? Are you in the Nova Scotia standard? what kind of money do you get from WCB, because they're different across the provinces. So there's lots of complicated nuances to a number of things, and there's many unanswered questions. So anyway, sorry to go on a bit long. It's been a real interesting discussion, and I think we need to do some work and continue these kinds of discussions as things move along. And so I'm really happy about the numbers we have tonight, and we look forward to working with everybody as we come together and continue this work. And we all need to be together, as I said, and others have said, on the same page, and continue to push for a worker agenda. Thanks again, everybody.
Thank you, Danny, and big thanks to the panelists and organizers, the CCPA, for pulling this all together. Thank you, everyone, and good night. We'll see you on the picket lines and all the other good places where we meet.